In one way, it's hard to imagine a hate movement directed at 50% of the population. But in another way, it's not. Laura Bates is founder of the Everyday Sexism Project. Her new book is Men Who Hate Women: From Incels to Pickup Artists, The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All. And she joins us now from London, UK. Thanks so much for being on the program. It's nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, in the introduction, I mentioned the Everyday Sexism Project. What is that?
The Everyday Sexism Project is a very simple website where people can share any experience of any form of gender inequality. It has hundreds of thousands of submissions from people around the world, mostly from women and girls. And the topics range from street harassment to workplace discrimination to sexual violence. And in part, the project is for awareness raising, for forcing people to acknowledge the extent to which sexism still exists in our society. But we also try to use it in a very targeted, practical way to change things. So we use the entries that we receive from young people to work with students at school on things like healthy relationships and sexual consent. We use the entries that we've received from women on public transport to work closely with transport police on tackling sexual offences on the transport network. And we're able to use specific subsets of the entries in other ways to work with individual businesses or organisations to try and prevent another generation of girls from growing up going through the same things.
Well, in this book, you immerse yourself in what you call the manosphere. I know this is not you didn't coin that term, but when I hear manosphere, it sounds kind of, it doesn't sound as serious as what you write about in the book. What is the manosphere?
That's right. And in fact, I think the term is quite problematic for that reason. It kind of trivializes and dismisses the issue. What we're actually talking about is a quite vast network of online communities. These are distinct communities, but in many ways they overlap with each other. It's a network that's made up of online forums, of private members groups, of chat rooms, of video blogs and blogs, of social media groups. And it consists of different communities, including incels, men's rights activists, pickup artists, so-called trolls, and men going their own way. So we're talking about a range of different men in these groups, but we're talking about groups that number in the tens to the hundreds of thousands. And we're talking about men who are, generally speaking, united by a real hatred and dehumanization of women.
Um, that is, when I hear that, I kind of freeze up. What draws men and boys to the manosphere?
Well, I think it's different depending on which aspects of it they come into contact with. I think it's important to say that they don't necessarily go straight to these communities. For many boys in particular, they're very cleverly groomed and radicalized into these extremist groups. It is a form of grooming and radicalization. It is a kind of extremism, but we don't tend to use those words to describe what's going on, just as we don't tend to use the term terrorist when a white man commits a mass shooting or a mass atrocity. So for many boys, the gateway to this will be perhaps a series of viral YouTube videos. It might be comedy memes on Instagram. It starts out with jokes and cultural touch points, and these groups are very clever and deliberate about using those techniques. They actually describe it as adding cherry flavor to children's medicine. They target boys as young as 11, and very gradually they're then drawn from there into these distinct communities where they are taught so-called facts about lying women, about a mass feminist conspiracy at the heart of our government, undermining men, about false rape allegations that are costing men their jobs and their lives, about the fact that men are supposedly the vast majority of victims of domestic abuse. It's a whole world of myth and misconception that casts white men as the real oppressed victims of today's society and women as evil oppressors who have to be taken down and punished at all costs.
You said they a couple of times. Who is they?
Well, we're talking about different groups. So we're talking about a group called incels. In particular, these are men who call themselves involuntarily celibate. In other words, they're men who aren't having sex and who want to be. But instead of looking at themselves for the reasons why that might be, they choose to construct this fallacy about a kind of huge societal conspiracy against them. They believe that a woman's role is to give them sex, and that if women are denying them that, then they need to be punished. And this might sound quite outrageous and ridiculous. You might assume from this idea that we're talking about just a handful of men, but we are actually talking, even within the incel community specifically, about groups that number in the hundreds of thousands, about forums with millions and millions of threads and comments and likes, about videos with millions of views. And we're talking about men who have gone offline and acted in the name explicitly of this ideology, men who have carried out massacres, mainly of women, in the name of this hatred of being incel, of the idea that women owe them sex and deserve to be massacred if they haven't given it to them. In the last 10 years alone, I've traced these ideologies to the murder or serious injury of over 100 people. Men like Elliot Rodger, the murderer behind the Santa Barbara massacre, men like Alec Manassian, the Toronto van attacker, but also others like the teenage boy in Toronto just over a year ago who walked into a massage parlor and killed a woman with a machete, like a teenage boy here in the UK who went on a 2-month stabbing spree attempting to murder 3 different women, like George Sidini, who walked into a yoga class and opened fire, murdering women. Again and again, these men have taken this ideology offline and directly, as a result of being radicalized in these communities, have massacred women. And yet it isn't a form of terrorism that we talk about, and we don't tend to use that word to describe it when it happens.
We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but you write that incels is short for involuntary celibate, and you say this in the book. You write, this isn't just a group of websites on which men spout random profanities and abuse. It is a movement cult-like in the loyalty and passion of its devotees. Incels are not just looking for a place to share rape fantasies on violent posts. They're invested in building and spreading an entire belief system to support and encourage such ideas. Why should we take this movement seriously?
Well, in part because that spreading of the ideas is happening in an incredibly effective and worrying way. Alec Manassian, for example, when he carried out his massacre in Toronto, talked about having been influenced by Elliot Rodger before him. He talked about wanting to influence others to rise up after him and kind of emulate him. And indeed, a man was later arrested and thought to have been planning a mass attack, having been inspired in turn by Alec Manassian. So we should be worried about this because these men are actively inciting others, many of them vulnerable teenage boys, actively inciting them to go offline and to commit similar atrocities. They canonize and revere these murderers. There are entire web pages set up within these communities just to celebrate these men who have carried out massacres, to call them saints, to talk about the great victory that they've struck for oppressed white men. And what's particularly worrying, I think, is the influence that they're having on young people, which is very much under the radar. We are alert for other forms of radicalization and grooming that happen online. We offer training and resources to teachers, for example, to look out for those other forms of radicalization. But this is a form of extremism that is not on the radar of counter-terror organizations.
Why is that?
Well, I think in part because of the way in which the media and the police report on this when it happens, the fact that when these men commit these atrocities, often the ideology in the name of which they're acting isn't reported, but also because the massacre of women by men is commonplace in our society. We are used to seeing women raped and beaten and murdered by men. Here in the UK, a woman is killed every 3 days on average by a current or former partner. Around the world, 1 in every 3 women will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. In a society where violence against women is so extraordinarily common, it's difficult for us to recognize it as an aberration, and we simply don't take it seriously enough.
Well, to understand this community better, you actually immersed yourself in this world for 2 years, I think, and you became Alex. Why?
Well, I thought that it was really important to experience it firsthand. I wanted to try and experience it from the perspective of a disillusioned teenage boy, to see how that kind of slippery slope worked, how the algorithms of popular social media platforms nudge you towards more and more extreme content, and how easy it is to gradually become desensitized to the very violent nature of the discourse that's going on in these communities. And I wanted the opportunity to communicate with them on their own terms, to talk to them, to really understand what was driving them and what was going on in these communities. And what I discovered was that a lot of it was significantly more violent and hate-fueled than I had really imagined even when I started.
Did you find you were pretending to be a teenage boy when you were in this world doing this research? Did you find that you yourself became desensitized?
To an extent, I think that there were, for example, extremely dehumanizing forms of language used to refer to women, which at first were very jarring, but which over time you simply became used to. You simply become used to seeing women referred to as foids, which is a shortening of female humanoids. This is how they refer to women. They don't want to give them the humanity of using the term woman. You become used to terms like roasties being used to refer to women who have sex. This is an incel reference to the idea that they mistakenly believe that women's genitalia are deformed by having too much sex and come to resemble slices of roast beef. There is a crudeness and a violence about the language in the communities, I think, that you do become desensitized to. And that was something very shocking to me. But nonetheless, you still stumble across certain things which shock you out of that. Or certainly for me, that was the case when I came across men who were, for example, one day swapping videotapes of women being injured and murdered. And one of them complained because he was upset that he couldn't hear the screaming as there wasn't any audio on the clip. On another day, I stumbled across a whole page which was just devoted to men's very brutal fantasies about raping me and giving me various internal injuries. So, no matter how many times I thought that I'd been acclimatized to how horrific it was, something else would come along that would lower the bar even further.
That is really jarring to hear. You do write in the book that one of the reasons why men and boys are drawn to these groups is they're seeking community. Did you come
Mhm.
across anyone who was in need of help or who was just experiencing loneliness?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to say that these are complex communities, as of course would be the case in any community of hundreds of thousands of people. It's very much the case that some of the men drawn into this movement are very vulnerable, that they, in some cases, are men who have existing, very real issues in their lives. Some of them have mental health problems. Some of them are just very lonely teenage boys looking for a sense of community. But it isn't fair to excuse the whole movement by suggesting that that applies to all of its members, because the vast majority of the discourse that you see on these sites is extremely hate-fueled and violent. It is very explicitly inciting violence and sexual violence against women. And many of the ringleaders and the kind of most prominent members of these communities very much know what they're doing and shouldn't be excused through this kind of victimhood narrative. So it's complicated, but it's no coincidence, I think you could say, that we've seen a rise in popularity of these movements amongst young people at a time when, here in the UK in particular, we've seen massive funding to youth centres, to youth funding where offline spaces might have previously existed for young men to have that sense of community, of responsibility, perhaps, of brotherhood, of purpose. So I think it's important that we look at ways in which we can tackle those very real problems without necessarily using them to excuse the actions and the very worrying rhetoric that's going on within these communities.
You mentioned Elliot Rodger and Alec Manassian. Did you find anyone in these communities who rejected their actions?
There was a very interesting case of a young man who had been very active in these communities since the age of 11. He'd been very much groomed and radicalized into them at a young age. He had become very slowly desensitized to the kind of violent rhetoric, and he felt that this was a place of safety for him. It was somewhere he thought that men gathered to blow off steam and to tell tasteless jokes. And when the Toronto van attack happened, he was really shocked and upset to see some people drawing links between this community that Manassian had referenced to police when he was arrested and this massacre. And he actually stood up for the community and went on air and did interviews saying, no, this isn't right. This isn't a community of murderers who want all women dead. This is really a support community for men. You've got it wrong. This is all irony and banter. It's just jokes. What was really interesting about that was that he found himself under a bombardment of attack, not from the mainstream or from feminists, which he anticipated, but from the incel community itself. He found them absolutely furious for misrepresenting him, and he was accused for misrepresenting them. He was accused of sanitizing their image in the public eye. They said, we want people to know that we do want women dead. That is what we want. It isn't irony. It isn't banter. So that was quite shocking, I think, that there can be a real disconnect between a misguided young person's perception of what these communities are and the reality of some of their more militant members, I guess.
You already mentioned this. There was a teen that was charged with killing a woman in a massage parlor in Toronto last year. And investigators added terrorism charges after they learned that the attack was inspired by the Incel movement. Should Incel-related attacks be considered acts of terrorism, in your view?
Yes, in my view, if you look at the kind of internationally accepted definition of terrorism, if you look at the fact that these men are acting in the name of a specific form of hatred against a specific demographic group, that they're trying to spread fear against that in that particular group, that they're trying to create social change according to their extremist ideology through these acts of violence, that they're explicitly targeting and massacring women because they hate women, all of these things for me mean that we should be looking at these as terrorist offenses. But that one case is the only time that terrorism charges have ever been brought in the case of an incel killing, despite the fact that such a large number of them have happened.
In the book, you spoke to one expert who believes that the adoption of misogyny as a hate crime would play a key role in shifting this conversation. Do you agree?
I think that it's a good step forward because I think it will allow police to record crime in a way that gives them the opportunity to spot patterns and repeat offenders. I think it sends an important societal message about the fact that these things, which are often brushed off, called banter or irony or jokes, excused and normalized and belittled, will actually be taken seriously. I think it sends an important message to victims, survivors, that they have the right to come forward and report these things, which they're often told to just put up with. But I don't think it's a silver bullet because encouraging people to report things to the police only works if the criminal justice system is functional. And in the case of women and sexual violence, we don't have a functional criminal justice system. Here in the UK, just 1.5% of rape cases reported to the police leads to a charge or summons. In other words, we live in a country where rape has effectively been completely decriminalized. So at that point, encouraging women to come forward and report to the police isn't necessarily the solution unless you're able to tackle the inherent racism and misogyny within that system.
If the attacks were characterized as terrorism, how would that stop them from happening?
Well, I think that it would free up resources and focus on the issue. Right now, when I contacted counter-terror organizations at government level in a number of countries, there was absolutely no awareness of incel terrorism at all. At one point on a phone call, I was put on hold and then asked to spell out the word incel. I found government accountability reports on how governments tackle mass attacks and terror, where it's clear that there are resources being devoted to tackling certain forms of extremism, and they include things like people with extreme views on animal rights or federal ownership of public lands. And yet, in the period spanned by the report, in which nobody had been killed by somebody with extreme views on animal rights, for example, there had been 3 mass attacks by men with connections to the manosphere, and those attacks didn't show up in the report. So, in terms of looking at how we as a country choose to focus our resources when we look at preventing radicalization, when we fund and resource teachers and train teachers to be able to protect young people from radicalization, it matters if there are types of extremism that are simply missing from that list because we don't acknowledge that they exist.
Some critics have raised concerns about treating incel violence as terrorism. Here's what Reem Badi from the University of Windsor and Fahad Ahmad from Carleton University had to say from the website The Conversation. They write, despicable incel-related violence may make us more comfortable with giving national security agencies the power to define good and bad ideologies. It should not. We must remember that these agencies will use their power on those who have not committed violence. Agencies will also act against those they consider at risk of violence that they deem unacceptable. Incel violence asks us to reflect on the societal reasons behind gender-based violence and how Canada can address this as a society-wide problem. We do not need and should not want an anti-terrorism response to misogyny. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think I just question why we don't really respond in the same way to other forms of terrorism. You know, nobody is saying, well, actually, we shouldn't consider Islamist terrorism to be a terror threat. We should look at what's driving these people to do it. People don't say that when we're talking about white supremacy, although we do often excuse and belittle and normalize the crimes of white supremacists. It's a similar problem there. Why is it that crimes of violence against women are the ones where we urge people to take a step back and to think about the motivation of the people who are carrying it out? Generally speaking, I think when it comes to the crimes of white men, we are much more ready to think about what's driving it, about what went wrong for these men. We see a media response that often talks about their childhood. We get quotes from neighbors saying that they were very kind and they helped out with DIY. As a society, we are much more comfortable with not labeling white male terrorists as terrorists than we are with other forms of terrorism. I think that those are criticisms that you could apply to any kind of legislation around terror attacks, and I'd question why we focus on this particular issue.
It's not lost on me that we're two women talking about this issue in a world where we're telling young girls that girls are the future, girls can do anything. Um, and we've talked about this issue before on the show, and we've had people respond in a way, or men respond in a way where it feels personal. How do you then get the people who should be talking about this to listen and for them to not feel as if they're being attacked in a world, again, where we're telling girls, saying girls are the future and boys need to change the way that they are?
I think it's really important that we stop describing this as a women's issue, that we stop talking about violence against women and start talking about male violence, because that is the issue that we're describing. I think that male allies have a real role to play in this. There are a lot of men right now saying, I'm aware of this stuff going on. How can I help? How do I become an ally? What do I do? And the answer is that more men leading this conversation and having these conversations privately with their friends and their family will make a big difference. Men hearing it from other men is one really positive way for us to move this conversation forward. But I also think for me, the fact that, as you say, we can't force every man in the world to sit down and listen to us talking about this is why it's important that we start talking about this much younger, that we start talking about it in schools where we can ensure that it's a message that reaches every child, because this is something that affects every child, because healthy relationships, sexual consent, gender stereotypes, the restrictions placed on all of us of any gender because of those stereotypes is a universal issue that affects us all. And for many of the teenage boys who are very vulnerable, who are drawn into these movements, it's absolutely devastating for them as well. So it really is in everybody's interest, I think, for us to look at this more fully as an issue that affects our society, and hopefully to look at education to try and tackle it from a much younger age. It's very difficult to de-radicalize people once they have fallen into the clutches of these communities, but it's much easier to practice prevention, to teach young people in an age appropriate way about internet literacy, about gender, about feminism, about sexual violence in ways that make them realize that this is a lesson for all of us. It's not about teaching girls to look out, to not wear short skirts, to not go to certain places late at night. We need to move past that narrative and onto a narrative that teaches all young people, and particularly men and boys, about their responsibilities, about sexual consent, about respect.
And you also say that men and boys are struggling. I think you cite a number how suicide is higher for men than it is for women.
Yeah, so one of the really tragic things about all of this is that these communities, often, particularly the men's rights community, they claim to care about particular issues and they raise particular issues, which often are really genuine, urgent issues affecting men and boys. So the male suicide rate is a very clear example of this. And within these online communities, these issues are used as a kind of trump card against feminism. They're used as a reason of kind of proof that there is this sort of feminist gynocracy, that the world doesn't care about these issues affecting men and boys, and instead it obsesses about women and sexism facing them. The truth is that these things are connected. They're not two completely opposed, polarized issues, and you have to pick a team. And if you care about what's affecting men and boys, then you have to hate women and deny that they have any problems. And if you're fighting for gender equality and talking about feminism, then you hate men and you ignore their issues. The truth is that they're deeply connected and entwined. The truth is that a lot of that male mental health crisis comes out of the fact that we raise children in a world where we teach them boys don't cry, men are tough and manly and violent and they control. And that's what boys grow up seeing in the media and learning. And by the point that you reach college age, fewer than a third of those accessing mental health services are male students. So then you have this tragically high male suicide rate, whilst we know that men are not receiving support when they experience mental health problems. And you can see that clearly what a large part of what's driving that is gender stereotyping, which of course is exactly what feminists are talking about tackling in the first place. We really should all be on the same side here. If we really care about these issues affecting men and boys, then we should be fighting all the battles that feminists are talking about fighting. The truth is that these communities don't really want to fight those battles. They pay lip service to these issues, but they actually don't do anything to try and tackle them. If anything, they very much double down on exactly the stereotypes that have often driven these men into despair in the first place. They tell them you have to beat your woman. In one particular case, they famously suggested that October Domestic Violence Awareness Month should be renamed Bash a Violent Bitch Month. They double down on the idea that men have to be powerful and manly and in control and unemotional, in part because it serves them. It serves these men to have men despairing and remaining in their communities where they're able to monetize them and to exploit them.
We have 30 seconds left, but the past year during this pandemic, we've all become super reliant on the internet, on online communities to keep us connected to work. What would you say to parents who are watching and listening to this, what they should look for?
I would say that having open and honest conversations with young people is very important, letting them know that they can come to you and talk to you about things that they've seen online. There are certain words that you can look out for, red flags, words like normies, like cucked, like triggered, like red pilled or black pilled. And I would say that just having a look at the online world that teenagers inhabit may be quite eye-opening for many adults. Have a look at viral YouTube videos with the word feminism in them and start to get a sense of what the reality is of the world that young people inhabit on a day-to-day basis, and it might be quite a shock.
Laura, thank you so much for spending time with us. I know that in the book you wrote about how you were scared about this book being published, but I do thank you because I think there's a lot in here that we can all learn. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.